Clint Eastwood stepped onto the stage at Loniar Arena in Dallas, Texas. No intro, no theme music, just him, and a silence so thick it felt almost holy. The lights sliced through the darkness, revealing his gray suit worn with time. His hair was snow white now, eyes sharp as ever, face unreadable, the face of a man who had seen far too much and spoken only when it counted. He said nothing. He didn't need to. Just minutes before, Robert De Niro, two-time Oscar winner, polished, loud, and always hungry for attention, had stepped under those very lights, grinning straight into the lens. Clint Eastwood, he declared, is the voice of a dead America, a relic in cowboy boots clinging to a country no one misses. The crowd split down the middle. Cheers rang out. So did boos, whistles, laughter. Half the room rose to its feet, in applause. The other half sat frozen, eyes fixed on the shadows where Clint waited, and he still didn't move. He didn't flinch. He didn't respond. He didn't come to argue. He wasn't there for a victory lap. He was there because sometimes silence becomes complicity when lies earn applause. This wasn't just TV. This was a standoff between two legacies, two eras. He won. Man built for noise, the other forged in quiet. On one side, Robert De Niro, sharp-suited, sharp-tongued, always delivering lines. On the other, Clint Eastwood, solid, silent, deadly in the way only a man who no longer has anything to prove can be. Later, when asked about what unfolded that night, Clint would respond with 7 words that would echo across the internet. You came to perform. I came to end the show. No flashy opening, no warm-ups, just 2 men, one chasing attention, the other ready to turn off the spotlight for good. The lights dimmed, emphasizing the contrast. De Niro stepped forward again. Black, suit flawless, styled like armor. The man looked like a storm dressed in silk. With Oscars behind him and a Hollywood reputation built on mobsters and anti-heroes, De Niro strutted to center stage, eyes locked on Clint like he was claiming territory. He grabbed the mic with the flair of a stage actor and scanned the crowd like a general on parade. "Let's stop pretending," he began, thick New York accent slicing through the air. "Clint Eastwood isn't a hero. He's a symbol of an America we should have buried years ago." The audience split again. Gasps, applause. Some sat stiff, others roared. In the back, a few voices pushed back. Boos, tension, crossed arms. A veteran wearing a cap didn't blink. A college student raised his phone. Live streaming. The host, Jack Reeves, glanced off camera, waiting for a cue that never came. De Niro began to pace, slow and deliberate, like a lawyer building his closing argument. He hasn't made a great film in years, he jabbed. He thinks a scowl is wisdom. He walks in here like the ghost of John Wayne. All I see is a man afraid of change. The crowd lit up, some cheering, some shouting. Hashtags were already flying. Acre Dead Cowboy began trending before the next sentence. Even landed. Then De Niro pointed, not at the crowd, but straight at Clint. "You call it loyalty. I call it stubborn pride. You talk like truth is your birthright. But the truth, Mr. Eastwood, is you're not the people's voice anymore. You're just an echo of a world that forgot how to grow." That's when the tide began to shift. A man, in the 4th row, called out, "Let him speak." Another added, "He's earned his place, De Niro." A woman near the aisle said softly, "He's not a relic. He's real." De Niro didn't flinch. He wanted more. He wanted a reaction. He was hunting it. "You want to defend this country? Fine," he said. "But don't act like your silence is virtue. You were gone when we needed you. And now you want to stroll in and play savior?" He paused, then opened his arms like a showman's bow. "He's not here for truth," De Niro said. "He's here because he misses the applause." And then, for the first time, he faltered. He looked at Clint, and for a brief second the smirk broke. Maybe it was Clint's stillness. Maybe it was the air, suddenly tight and still. Maybe he knew he had crossed a line, but he pushed on anyway. "Go. Ahead, Mr. Cowboy," he challenged. "Let's see if the myth can survive the moment." The room cracked open. Cheers, jeers, shouts, applause. It felt like the entire country had been bottled into one room. Divided, tense, electric, and in. The eye of it all stood Clint Eastwood. Still. Silent. Waiting. The silence stretched. Long. Uncomfortable. Unshakable. Robert De Niro shifted his weight on stage, his grin starting to twitch at the corners. The crowd had been noisy moments ago, but now they waited. All eyes turned to the man who hadn't moved. Clint Eastwood stood like a monument, still framed in shadow, his presence louder than any monologue De Niro had delivered. Then, without a word, he stepped forward. No music, no cue, just the sound of his shoes against the hardwood. Each step cut through the tension like a blade. He reached the mic slowly, his fingers brushing it once. Then he looked out, not at De Niro, not at the host, but at the people, all of them. The room fell into a silence so thick you could hear a breath 4 rows back. And then Clint spoke, his voice low, even, the kind of voice that didn't rise because it didn't need to. "You talk a lot about truth," he said, eyes steady. "You toss it around like it's a script you memorized this morning. But truth doesn't need applause. It doesn't show up with makeup and a lighting crew." He let the pause hang for just a moment before continuing. "You don't like what I stand for? Fine, say it plain. But don't pretend that shouting makes you right. I didn't come here to sell nostalgia. I came here because there are still people who believe a man's word means something, even when he says less of it." The audience remained frozen, as if each word pinned them in place. Clint didn't flinch. He didn't play to the crowd. He never looked at the cameras. His eyes stayed locked forward, speaking to the soul of the room, not its spectacle. "You think this country needs louder voices," he said. "I think it needs steadier hands." That's when the first applause started. Slow, scattered. A woman in the front row, a man in the back. Then others joined. Not a roar. Not yet. But something was building. Clint glanced at De Niro, not as an opponent, but as a man who'd just walked himself into a deeper conversation than he was ready for. "I didn't come here to play hero," Clint said, voice even, clear. "I came because when men who should no better start rewriting history to get applause, someone's got to show up and remind them how quiet truth really is." The room stirred now, energy shifting. Clint wasn't shouting. He wasn't performing. He was dismantling a performance with nothing but calm, unwavering words. "You said, 'I'm the voice of a dead America,'" he said slowly. "No, I'm the voice of the America that doesn't need to scream to be heard." Then he stepped back. That was it. No mic drop, no dramatic exit. Just silence again. So full it felt like thunder. De Niro stood stunned, his body still but eyes racing. The host looked from one man to the other, unsure whether to step in or simply let the moment breathe. But it was too late. The room had already made its choice. The applause grew. Not forced, not prompted, but rising like a tide. People on their feet. Others still frozen in place, wrestling with what had just hit them. Clint didn't raise a hand. He didn't smile. He simply stood there, watching, as if waiting to see whether the room would recognize its own reflection. Then, as the applause began to swell, Clint offered just 3 more words. Quietly, to the crowd, to De Niro, and maybe even to himself. "Now we begin." The crowd was still rising to its feet as Clint Eastwood turned away from the microphone and returned to his place at the side of the stage. He didn't look for a reaction. He didn't soak in the applause. He simply stepped back like a man finishing a job he didn't want but knew had to be done. Robert De Niro, still center stage, seemed suddenly adrift. His expression caught somewhere between disbelief and something deeper, something edging toward respect, though his pride would never let it show. The host, Jack Reeves, cleared his throat and stepped forward, trying to catch his balance between the power that had just shifted and the need to keep the event moving. "Well," he said, voice wavering slightly, "that was unexpected." The crowd laughed, nervous, unsure if they were allowed to laugh yet. But the ice had cracked. Something fundamental had turned in the room. Darrow raised his mic again, but it was clear now the wind had gone out of him. His voice was less sharp, more cautious. "Look," he said, trying to recover, "I never said Clint Eastwood hadn't earned respect. What I said, what I meant, is that we can't keep pretending. The old ways are sacred just because they're old." He paused, looking for the applause that no longer came. "Times change. What worked once doesn't work anymore." Clint didn't move. He didn't blink. He simply listened, as if giving Darrow all the rope he needed. Darrow paced again, this time less like a showman and more like a man trying to remember his lines. "We don't need stoicism," he continued. "We need adaptation, emotion, vulnerability, the strength to admit we're wrong." Clint turned slightly, not all the way, just enough to face the man who had been lecturing him. "You think I never admit when I'm wrong?" Clint asked, voice calm as ever. "I've buried friends because of mistakes I made. I've spent nights praying for the strength to look my own sons in the eye after letting them down. You think silence means I feel nothing?" He paused, and this time there was no applause, just stillness. "You want to talk about vulnerability? Try living with the weight of what you didn't say, what you should have said, long after the world moved on." Darrow stood frozen, mic in hand, unable to respond, because Clint hadn't argued with him. He had undressed him, pulled back the curtain on performance, and left something raw in its place. Clint stepped forward again, slow, measured. "The problem isn't that people don't speak. The problem is that too many speak without listening first." He scanned the crowd, his gaze sweeping across faces that had gone from entertained to confronted. "We built a country on grit, not because we were perfect, but because we tried to be better. Every generation doesn't have to erase the last to find its way." A woman in the third row nodded slowly. A man with folded arms dropped them. Something was shifting again, not just in the room, but in the people. Clint didn't raise his voice. He didn't sway his body. He simply stood in his truth like it was a shelter he had built with his own hands. "I'm not afraid of change," he said. "I'm afraid of forgetting who we were when we had to fight for it." That landed, not with a boom, but with a weight that settled deep in the gut. Darrow lowered his mic. He looked off stage as if hoping someone would step in. No, one did. Clint looked at him one last time, not with anger, not with triumph, but with something like understanding. "You think you're challenging me," he said. "But the real challenge is remembering what it cost to get here and not throwing that away for applause." He stepped back, not a mic drop. Just a man returning to silence, his favorite weapon. And the crowd, once again, stood up for him. The standing ovation didn't roar. It rumbled, slow and deep like distant thunder rolling in across the plains. It wasn't the cheer of celebrity worship. It was the kind that rises when people recognize something real, something steady, something rare. Clint Eastwood didn't acknowledge it. He stood still, his eyes level, his face set like a monument that refused to be moved by noise. Robert De Niro didn't speak. For the first time all night, he looked unsure, an actor who couldn't find his next line. The confidence, the momentum, the fire he had walked in with had been hollowed out by a man who used no tricks, no rehearsed lines, just the weight of lived truth. Jack Reeves, sensing the shift had reached its peak, cleared his throat and tried to interject. "Let's pivot, shall we?" he said awkwardly, glancing between the two men. "Let's talk legacy. What do we leave behind, not as actors, but as Americans? Darrow took that as his moment, stepping forward with a shaky nod. Legacy, he said, voice more subdued now, isn't about nostalgia. It's about what survives us, what evolves beyond us. We can't keep playing the same parts and expecting different stories. He looked toward Clint, his eyes searching, now less defiant. Respectfully, he added, you've had your era, and it mattered, but if we don't allow the next one to breathe, we suffocate progress. He paused, waiting for the crowd, but it remained still. No clapping, no shouting, just listening. Clint waited a moment before responding, letting the weight of the silence do its work. Then he stepped forward, slowly, his voice low but steady as stone. You talk like time is a thief, he said, like it's your job to chase out the old so the new can breathe. But time doesn't steal anything. We give things away, bit by bit, until we forget what we were supposed to hold on to. He looked directly at Darrow, not with spite, but with the kind of calm that only comes from knowing exactly where you stand. You think the next era needs permission? It doesn't. It just needs roots. And you don't get roots by cutting down every tree that stood long enough to cast a shadow. A hush swept the room again, not forced, but earned. Clint didn't stop there. He stepped even closer to the edge of the stage, his voice warming but never rising. I've played the cowboy, the soldier, the quiet man who does the hard thing, when no one else will. Not because those are roles we should cling to, but because those are values we forgot how to speak without irony. He glanced at the crowd, people leaning forward now, not in entertainment, but in reflection. Legacy isn't your name in lights. It's how people speak when they remember you, when they whisper what you stood for long after you've gone. Darrow lowered his gaze. He wasn't defeated, but he was changed, pulled into a deeper room than the one he thought he'd be performing in tonight. Clint gave him one last look, not dismissive, not gloating, just final. Progress without memory is just motion, Clint said, and motion without meaning is how we got lost in the first place. The crowd didn't rise this time. They didn't cheer. They just sat there, quiet, thoughtful, changed. Jack Reeves, now clearly emotional, stepped forward slowly. Gentlemen, he said, voice unsteady, I don't think I'm the only one who feels like something important just happened here. Clint gave a small nod, turned, and began walking off stage. Not in triumph, not in retreat, but like a man who'd said exactly what needed saying and knew it didn't require a curtain call. Darrow stood still, watching him go, and for a long moment after Clint vanished into the shadows, the room remained frozen, still absorbing the truth they'd all come to hear, even if they hadn't known it. Outside the studio, the Texas night air was still and heavy, the kind of quiet that settles only after something real has been said. Clint Eastwood stepped out alone. No entourage, no flash of cameras, no producers in his ear. Just the echo of his own footsteps and the distant hum of conversations still unraveling inside. He didn't check his phone. He didn't glance back. He walked like a man who had long since stopped performing, long since stopped asking for permission to speak. The truth. Inside, the audience remained seated, as if getting up too quickly might shatter the moment. Some whispered. Others stared ahead, unsure what to make of what they'd just witnessed. Robert Darrow sat alone now, the fire in him dimmed, not extinguished, but re-aimed. He wasn't the villain. He wasn't the fool. He had walked in with words and had met someone who spoke in something heavier than rhetoric. Weight. And in that weight, he'd been reminded what legacy really looks like. Not a brand, but a compass. Jack Reeves eventually wrapped the show, but even he could tell the evening had drifted off script in a way no teleprompter could have foreseen. The network had expected fireworks. What they got was a masterclass. No shouting match, no meltdown. Just one man standing taller by saying less, and another man realizing, maybe for the first time, how much strength that truly takes. By the time the crowd filtered into the parking lot, something strange had happened. There was no spin. No one argued about who won. The internet was already lighting up, not with memes, but with quiet quotes. Clips of Clint's lines were being shared not for laughs, but for clarity. No filters, no edits. Just moments of a man choosing purpose over applause. And maybe that was the most viral thing of all. Not the spectacle, but the absence of it. Back home, Clint Eastwood would later say nothing to the press. No interviews, no reaction videos. He simply returned to his routine, rising with the sun, feeding the horses, working with his hands, because men like him don't go looking for moments. They become them. And those watching from afar, they were left with something far more valuable than a headline. They were left with a question. What kind of legacy am I leaving behind? If that moment moved you, even just a little, do one thing right now. Hit that like button, subscribe for more stories that go deeper than headlines, and drop a comment below telling us one value you think this world needs to remember. Because truth doesn't need to shout. It just needs to be carried.